All right,
So I'm recording now.
cool. All right. Well, we are here to discuss the discussion question for week 4. And basically we were asked to read an article to kind of identify what type of study was performed, and then look at it from a different lens and change the type of methodology that was used, and then kind of discuss about how that might have changed what the findings were or what the intent of the study was. So Toni and I have one edition of our textbook, and we did Appendix E, which was an ethnography. Trice also did an ethnography with the most updated textbooks, and they are different ethnographies. So Toni and I are going to be a little more interactive with each other as far as like content, but Trice is going to kick it to us for questions as he kind of explains his study, and we're going to try to be on Team Trice here as well, but may not have quite the context of his study.
Thank
So our study was on a ethnography on rethinking subculture resistance, core values of the straight edge movement. Kind of just really bullet points. Essentially, the researcher who had participated in this culture kind of through long term with over 25 plus participants, through interviews and being involved, and not being involved, but being observing over time, this group of straight edge young adults and teenagers, essentially kind of poured out of that study, essentially, their values, how their values related to resistance, why this, their kind of straight edge group represented them, like the self-realization that they get from being part of the straight edge, why they felt that straight edge was counterculture as opposed to other cultures that straight edge meaning didn't participate in drugs, didn't have kind of relationships, sexual relationships very quickly with people, but essentially meaningful relationships and that type of thing. So our study was more to describe the culture, to describe, in particular, the lens was talking about resistance to kind of macro culture, and how this was a response to macro culture, a particular response, and then just kind of documenting the culture. Toni, am I missing some things here? Is there important things you'd like to fill in?
I just felt like that it was documented that this was primarily in the 1980s, early 1980s. The group were majority middle-class white males from age 15 to 25. And one thing that a lot of them mostly did, that they were mostly related to the punk genre of music, and a lot of them put an X on their hand whenever they attended any kind of like punk genre music concerts. So that way, kind of identify them as being part of like this straight edge, living the straight edge lifestyle.
And like a lot of the conclusion is talking about the meanings that the people in this culture have about being a part of that culture. So they both recognize that they are there, they recognize, and the researcher kind of took through these interviews kind of, what this meant and what this culture really, a descriptive view of the culture also, like I said, with this framework lens on social resistance. So part of our assignment is to flip that on its head. And so one way I thought you could look at this a little bit differently, instead of looking at kind of this culture of people and describing that culture, and then also, kind of using a framework to describe the themes, I thought, well, what if this particular culture is associated with hardcore music. What if you looked at just one hardcore band and kind of those participants in that band and made it a case study? And so looking at that band, that particular hardcore band, like really looking at their music, looking at the art associated with their music, looking at, the kind of like the fans' popular culture and what fans post online about that particular band, in addition to conducting, focus groups with the band or individual, using that as one single focus and case study to just really kind of understand that instance of this subculture. And so that would be a way to kind of look at this entirely differently, because no longer are we looking through this theoretical framework of resistance. No longer are we looking to just describe the cultural, meaning that these individuals have across a category of them. Now we're looking at a particular instance, and what that particular instance and its manifestation in this hardcore band, all the associated articles and facts and descriptions and art associated with them. So I thought that would be one way, certainly what you would get out of that is something more specific and something about this case and this particular band and this particular music. Because it is a band, the music and the art is going to be more centered than the kind of cultural overview that you would have in an ethnography. So that was my thought.
Can I jump in here really quick? Because this also is an ethnography for this most current version, and these things have a lot of similarities. The current version talks about these young men that are of Muslim descent, or they have the Muslim religion that they identify with, even though they are of Pakistani and Bangladeshi, their ethnicities, right? And so there's a lot of, if you will, conflating that just under the Muslim moniker, there's there's this monolith, if you will, right? This talks about a culture in Britain that is really looking at getting rid of or really demonizing the the Islamophobia aspect of things. And so as you talk about looking at it from a cultural standpoint, from the ethnography standpoint, my thought process too was to look at the case study, or look at it from a case study view. And it was for a couple of reasons. One, in class, Dr. B talked about, something that I was interested in. And she said, hey, that you may want to consider a case study. So I've been really kind of biased towards a case study. And that was interesting and very, it was difficult too, because everything that I was thinking about kept going back to that. All that is to say, to look at it from these four guys, or these four young men, also within the age of 20 to 25 years old, if we want to look at it from a case study, so now as looking at it as these four people in this culture, to be more specific, as you said, from a case study standpoint, to now, okay, maybe we grab one of them and follow these guys along. And here's a particular case that's going to be more specific that way. I'll be quiet now and go ahead, Toni.
So I also thought about the case studies, and then I also did think about the grounded theory. So so since you both talked about case study, I'll look at more the grounded theory. So I was looking at that one because especially I read the appendicite, and how there's some similarities in how they chose to do the study for both of them. So one thing I noticed that like they they got similar amount of women involved for appendicite D and E, and they got similar amount of age group involved too. So I was looking at that and reading more about it, and I feel like that the grounded theory could work in a way, especially with the subculture. So within the appendicite each, when we looked at with the gentleman for like doing a straight edge, they had a lot of subcultures, like t-shirt slogans. They had those who abstain from sex until they're in committed relationships. Those committed vegetarians, things like that. And within those subcultures, also with within grounded theory, they did break people up into having different phases. So those subcultures can be looked at as phases. So as they mature in age. So usually you would think, most of the time you would think those who are in their teenagers aren't really looking at like long-term relationships. So they may not be in that stuff. They may not be in that field yet. So maybe they're looking at more so like the reason why the lyrics can relate to them. Those who are in like maybe that 20 plus age are looking at more now why those long-term relationships being effective for them. And then also too, I did see how the author followed the group for 14 years. So rather than following for 14 years, you may have to pick which group you want to follow. So you can't follow all of them, but pick the age group. So maybe start at 15 because you can see from 15 how they progress. Are they going to keep on that straight edge lifestyle? So you see at 15, like they committed to this, they started this. Where are they at 18? Where are they at 21? Where are they at 25? Because those usually involve big milestones. 15 kind of like beginning of high school, 18 ending high school, starting college, 21 maybe at the middle of college, graduating college, and 25 kind of getting settled into your career. So check it back in with them at those different milestones. So I know that I would say it could be a mixture of ground theory and case study with that one.
So your thought is to kind of like document a particular subpopulation with this idea that you're going to come up by observing them when they kind of go through these, what is kind of seems to have been identified in this research as these different phases. You're going to try to look at those those men or women coming into those phases and try to, based on what you observe, come up with a theory of their change in between one stage to another. Like, what is the theory that is emerging from this particular group, and what does that tell us about members in the group and their transformation as they join and then become either more and more engaged or less and less engaged, and kind of a theory of this particular philosophy and how someone grows through it.
Right, correct.
I would like to toss in there that interesting, you talk about 14 years was this ethnography, right? The one that I looked at talked about 3 years. Yeah. And you see the challenges, at least in this version of the book, talks about one of the challenges of ethnography, if I can say that correctly. And it kept coming back to me because, again, I continue to try to now apply this and see what this looks like foresight wise as we do research, right? As I'm doing research, I'm not, I don't know if I want to do 3 years, of following for 14 years, right? So I kept coming back to that. But another thing really quick, and it says, and I quote, the less the depth in any single, how does it go? Just stay with me for a second. One of the challenges is that the more you add in the case, is this case study, right? It dilutes the overall analysis. So if you take one person, if we're just studying Toni, right? So then we can go deeper into Toni's life and understand what's happening with her, but then we add Alisha, then we add Trice, then that's going to dilute Toni's, her contributions and the things that we're looking at in regards to research. So that's just something that may be a tangent, but these are the type of things that I'm thinking about as far as, moving forward and research. And I know we're probably off the topic, but I'll bring it back I'll bring it back to say, so when you're flipping, you're thinking about a case study, you're thinking about an ethnography, you're thinking about, Toni, which one did you just talk about?
Grounded theory.
The grounded theory. And I'm also thinking about phenomenology, right? What is this a phenomenon, right? So these are the things that I'm still struggling. Like, is this a phenomenon that's happening? And I think for me, that's where I'm still struggling with that, is because there's so much overlap in all of these, right? Or the opportunity for all of them to kind of be complementary of each other. So you have to be very detailed with your questions. But I'm done. I had to get that out of here. So
no, I think that is so germane to what this whole conversation is. I think, when I came here, I was like kind of confident with like, oh, this is how it would flip and how, but I kind of narrowed my focus. But you're right. I think it actually is kind of complex. And I think we're so applying right now. I don't think we know what we're gonna really study, right? Like, and we have this big, like, I have an oval of lots of potential and opportunity. And I think as we kind of narrow it down, we really have to base it on what are we interested in knowing? And that drives both the methodology and the approach, because what you said about, if you want to look at the one person and kind of tell their story in this kind of chronological understanding of capturing that individual, because that individual represents something you're interested in, that's a narrative. And it may be just as extensive as, ethnography, because it really is to kind of understand and chronologicalize that one potential. Where a case study, you're not looking at the person. You're looking at the whole totality of circumstances of that case.
Yes.
I think like in your instance, like when we're talking about these, you know, kind of Muslim men and this kind of context, the case would be maybe a particular subgroup of that men who attend a single mosque, or maybe they go to one study group at that mosque. And so you understand the physicality of where they meet, you understand the time of when they meet, you understand that versus, you know, when you look at something like a phenomenology, and this is the one where I get a little like, am I right? So in ours, we have this subgroup of straight edge people who are hardcore, who like hardcore in the sense of like there was, you know, you didn't drink once, you didn't have meat once, or else you were no longer apart. And the symbol of being straight edge was having X's. You wore it at all times. You probably got it in a tattoo. That phenomenon of being that stringent, you know, studying the what and the how of that particular subgroup to understand how and why and what it means, you know, what it is to them that gets them to that extremism, and how they present, you know, how we understand that extremism when you're already in a pretty extreme subgroup to begin with. So maybe that's a phenomenology. We just want to kind of understand that kind of offspring. But I think all of it's, I think because we're so young in our research and we're so young in our topics, it's really like, it is really hard to kind of articulate what our focus is. And that, I do think this chapter and this assignment did a good job of like making me understand that that's actually like so core to how you move forward.
And then I think also too, if we were to do like the case study and then how, for example, in ours that me and Alisha read, the person who studied the group studied them for 14 years. I don't know if you mentioned that. He studied them for 14 years. So if you're doing a case study that's lasting 14 years, some biases will definitely start to arise.
Great point. Great point.
So, and as with the case study, you want to try to keep those biases as down as you can. So that's something to keep in mind too. So definitely have to, I would say, by selecting, like Alisha mentioned too, we mentioned having, if you're going to do a case study for the last 14 years, you're going to definitely need to have one group you're focusing on. You can't do that large age difference. You can't do that large. They're going to X amount of concerts. You have to stick with one focus throughout the whole time.
I want to make sure that we cover all bases because we're going to need all our points. So identify that for edition 4, Appendix E, this ethnography study was by Mack and Gall and Hayward, titled British-Born Pakistani and Bangladeshi Young Men Exploring Unstable Concepts of Muslim Islamophobia and Racialization. I would say this too, and I'll pose this last question because it's interesting, and this is where I'm at. You first have to understand the book says one approach thoroughly, then venture out and try another approach before combining different ways of conducting qualitative research. Do any of you feel like you understand any one of these 5 thoroughly right at this point?
No, but I think with more reading, I could. It wasn't bad start, but more reading definitely is needed.
And his other comment was, you need in chapter 5, hey, you need to actually read studies. Like, you know,
right.
You're not going to learn it by this. And so that is also like a point well taken. I feel as though we will get there because, you know, the bulk of what we've been learning to this point hasn't really been research based. I mean, a lot of like we started to see that last semester. They're kind of doing these researches, the research on like post-COVID online courses, but a lot of ours are like critical issues, you know, late breaking, or here's, you know, my point of view from a think tank type thing. I do think now, because we're kind of turning into the research part of being back students and then also having to start collecting for our lit review, just for our general understanding of our topic, this is going to be more the stuff that we're reading. And I do think it'll be easier for us to kind of articulate the differences. I mean, if I felt like I had more research background because I took a couple PhD classes at Western, but I realized I had not done much in ethnography at all. Like up until I read this, the chapter 4, I probably could have like I kind of understand critical race theory because I took a linguistics class, you know, like, and so I remember talking about how linguistics and critical race theory, you know, that's a really easy kind of like very language is very easy to see where, you know, you can kind of be marginalized or dismissed based on, you know, cultural language, right? But other than that, like I couldn't have said anything. And even this, just like, okay, so we have this kind of cultural structural thing, and I'm still trying to like analyze it using the same scientific theory, you know, where I'm like, okay, well, what is the hypothesis here that this study is trying to like either articulate or go again? And I'm like, no, that's not the point of this. The point of this is just to lay out and represent the culture this person is saying. And so, you know, I think we have a ways to go, but I also think now, you know, it's kind of critical in understanding that.
Okay, I'm just wondering because I was wrestling, okay, with this stuff all week. So, how you folks feel about this one? We good?
Yeah, I think so. We'll make sure to post